Hi, Colin. So nice to reconnect with you after, oh my goodness, I followed your work for a while, huh?
It has been a while. Yeah.
Um,
More than a decade. A decade. About a decade. Yeah.
about a decade, right? So for
Yeah.
those listening, I am sitting with documentary photographer Colin Boyd Shafer, whom I think I found on social media years ago on a first project called Cosmopolis Toronto. And we're going to be talking about your most recent project, really great project in the form of a book. But maybe we could start by having you introduce yourself, what interested you in doing the type of photography work that you do and sort of what that means to you.
So I think you already mentioned it, but my name is Colin Boyd Shafer, and I do call myself a documentary photographer. And I think that's because I primarily am interested in telling true stories, I guess, stories that are placed in reality through imagery. I'm also a high school educator, and Cosmopolis Toronto, as you mentioned, was kind of the first major project where not only a major project, but also connected to the process of migration, which has kind of been an important theme in a lot of the projects that I've pursued. But I do tend to lean towards bigger series, bigger stories, bigger projects, and this particular one that we're talking about today is as big as they probably will ever come,
Mhm.
and it involves many years and
Mhm.
many encounters, and the end result is this book.
I could only assume it's definitely a passion project that requires years. Um, so the name of the book is Finding American, and it's a photography book filled with a lot of stories. And in reading sort of the setup that you kind of give us in the book, you talk about it being set up in sections, and the idea that you also had to connect with people to meet sort of the people that you highlight in the book. So let's talk about process a bit there, in terms of what the logistics were in making those connections.
Um, I really didn't have an idea of how big the United States was. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
and so I'd say, firstly, like looking back, I was probably a little ignorant towards how big of a project it was to pursue doing anything across all 50 states.
Right.
Um, because of the networks that I've built from doing projects like Cosmopolis Toronto, um, I'm familiar with the process of reaching out through social media to people,
Mm-hmm.
um, to say, this is what I want to do. Can you help me? Um, this is a little more complex because you're reaching out to people that have more of a distant connection to you than,
Right.
it's different than saying, hey, I'm from Kitchener and I'm doing a project in Toronto. But in this case, it's, I'm in a place that you may have never heard of. We have a mutual friend, who doesn't even necessarily know I'm messaging you. And I am, reaching out to you through this medium that oftentimes there's, spammers and scammers. And I'm saying, like, hey, look, please listen to me, like help me find someone. So that's one way. I did a lot of, reading articles um, that then would include people in them that I thought maybe I could, reach out to, people that are interested in the topic of immigration in general. And then, of course, organizations that work with community members in
Mm-hmm.
particular places. And, in some places, it was really easy to find people that wanted to participate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then in some states like Montana or North Dakota, it takes a lot of effort. And I didn't have any, friends of friends of friends of friends
Mm-hmm.
who were in those places. So but there were a lot of months before hitting the road
Mm-hmm.
to reach out. And then also while I was doing it, I would also make connections to people who thought, no, like I know you haven't been to Rhode Island, but I'd really like you to meet, this person that I know.
Right.
Um, so there's interesting kind of lineages and linkages between peoples that are in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But I did look at the basic demographics of the country, and when planning out like how many people I would meet, I knew that I was going to be meeting more people in Texas,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Right.
because there's more immigrants in Texas, and it
Right.
would be a better representation to have more stories, in Texas in the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's yeah, the bigger states are, more well represented, but that's because they are just a bigger part of the country.
Right. It's just population numbers at that point as well.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so, so it sounds like you were doing research before even setting off on these road trips because it was a few road trips, I'm assuming. Um, and what was it like when you first embarked on the road trips versus, you've done it like maybe year one, year two, and what was that something that kind of hit you or anything that you learned that helped you along with the subsequent trips?
Um, I mean, in the beginning, I didn't know like, where we would stay.
Right.
And I had a participant, someone who actually is in the book, but is a friend from previous work. He'd messaged me and said, you should really look into couch surfing,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is like Airbnb, but it's free. So there's an app and you request to stay with people. And, this is obviously all pre-COVID.
Oh, yes.
Um, and so, yeah, it was a little strange because the first night that we stayed, and my wife, I mean, now my wife, and we have, our second child coming along, but at this time, um, she was my fiance. So my fiance and I, crossed the border into Vermont, um, which was also kind of weird because I'd always crossed like major
Oh,
border crossings,
mm-hmm.
but when you cross the border in a place like Vermont, you're literally just driving through a dirt road.
Road.
And then we missed the border checkpoint, which was rather interesting because I really needed to pee. And I really needed to pee. And um I said to and I think we were running low on gas. And I
Right.
said to Kate, I think we crossed the border.
Yeah,
And
you're
then
in.
she's like, well, is that it back there? And I was like, yeah, I think that's the border. So we actually drove back to the border, like the little guardhouse,
Yes.
which looked like, a little shed.
Mm-hmm.
And I pull up to the window and the guy's like, how long were you in the country for? And I said, like, I don't like a
I
minute. Like,
mean,
I don't. Yeah. And then he said, well, sir, he's like, you're going to have to come back through and then do it again so I can like stamp so they can stamp your
right.
foot.
Yeah.
So it was a very awkward, uncomfortable, strange entry
Mm.
to begin the trip. We didn't run out of gas. I found a washroom, but yeah, it was like you're just in the countryside.
Right.
Um, but then we pull into Vermont, and we were that first night we were going to be staying at our first couch surfing host place, and it's just I mean, keep in mind this was like height of Trumpism,
Mm.
and that first house that we pulled up to, they had, you know, a little, I think it was a pride flag on their door. And it was just like, it felt very welcoming, right? You're like,
Right.
oh, okay.
You look
Like,
for clues.
yeah, like these people are like, these Americans are going to be really, so anyways, we knock on the door, and sure enough, they're a couple. Their house is a complete mess.
Hmm.
And, uh, they have a brand new baby. And so the husband was so tired that when he was talking to us, he was actually like, he was holding the baby, but also almost falling, like he was kind of
Yeah.
falling asleep, you know, with the
With the
baby.
baby.
And it was just so sweet
Hmm.
that they wanted to host
Right.
someone when they were at such a, like, now as a, you know, a person who's had a baby. I know
Right.
that the last thing I would want is like two random strangers coming to my
Mm.
house. But they were, you know, they invited us in, and, you know, and gave us a place to sleep. And so that was our entry into couch surfing,
Mm.
which then, you know, convinced my wife, you know, then fiance, that this was a good idea.
Right.
And we kept doing it. And without doing it, we probably wouldn't have been able to, like, I don't know what I would have done, because it's just too expensive to, it was
Exactly.
still a very, very expensive project to do, because you're paying for gas and food and everything else.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, couch surfing saved the project for sure.
And that
Um,
makes sense, right? Because, we see the finished product in a beautiful book package, but there's a lot of planning and, like you said, spend expenses that are not always covered by grants or, other sources. So it really is not just your time, but it's also your money going into
Yeah,
this.
and I mean, it really was like, and I think it's important to emphasize, because I don't want someone seeing this and thinking like, you know, it wouldn't matter how many books I sell. Like this isn't going to be, this was not a good idea financially. Um, you know, we'd been teaching for a couple years, both Kate and I,
Mm.
in Bulgaria, at an American school, and um, you know, had a little bit of savings,
Right.
and no baby or anything, no real.
Yeah.
So putting some money towards doing something, like, because it felt like doing, you know, like I could have donated some money to an organization that I felt strongly about, or I believed that I could take that same amount and try to make something bigger out of it that would have a positive
Hmm.
um, impact. You know, using the same skills and idea that I'd already used to do previous projects.
Right.
Um, so, I mean, I guess to answer your initial question, that that experience, you know, is very different. And it's important to emphasize that, like, the experiences of people in Vermont are, it's entirely different than the people who, you know, you're meeting in Louisiana. Like,
For sure.
it's not the connection between Kitchener, Ontario, and, you know, wherever Vermont or wherever New Hampshire, um, are very similar. Like, you
Mm.
could you could you could really feel like you haven't crossed the border.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas, you know, and I don't know where you know, that line can that line can be complicated, because I mean, my family's from Ohio,
Hmm.
and like, Ohio's still, like, it's not that far away, and it's
Right.
northern,
Yeah.
but it still has a lot of elements that make it very different than where I live.
Hmm.
Um, but the New England kind of states feel very similar to where we are.
Hmm.
Um, and then that, you know, also translates to the experiences of immigrants in those places. And
For sure. For
yeah,
sure.
um, yeah, I don't think that answers your question, but it all was, you know, dependent on what state
You were going into.
you're going to, and
Yeah.
then, you know, and then also, like, the logistics of getting to that area. Like, you can
Hmm.
cover a lot of states in the Northeast, but
Right.
then once that's done and I'm back, because I could only be, because of health insurance, I could only be on the road for 3 months at a time.
Fine, okay.
And then I could only be in the US for half of a year
That's right.
because of residency or whatever. So
Mm.
that's, that's why I was dipping in and out of Canada or taking breaks in between, where was to for those reasons. But also like in reality, mental exhaustion. Like,
I was gonna say physically tiring, but also mentally, as well.
yeah, I mean, for my wife and I to be in a small like Prius, meeting people daily who have emotional stories to share and are like trusting you with their lives, essentially. Um, that's one thing, but then also to be staying in the houses of people who are keen on getting to know you and you want to present your best self. Like, you don't show up to a stranger's house and be like, "Where's the bed? Let me sleep."
Right.
Your first thing is, "Hey, like, how are you?" Like, and then they say, "Come on and sit down, like, let's talk." And so then you talk and you share, and um, sometimes, that person themselves might think maybe they're lonely, maybe they're interested, maybe they have plans, maybe they've invited a few friends that are going to come over because they heard you're from Canada and
And
this friend is in Canada, and you're not going to say no. So you say yes to
exactly.
everything. And then you're also not eating, the same food that you might be eating at home.
Hmm.
Like Kate and I said it in the beginning, we're like, we're not going to eat at any fast food restaurants. That was like the commitment. Like, it's no chains. We're going to support local establishments, and that lasted for like 2 states, and then we
Hmm.
were eating every, and
What's near,
drinking.
I suppose, as well. What's near and available, and
Yeah, yeah. You just like convenience and a lot of granola bars.
right.
A lot of snacks.
Hmm.
But it's not the healthiest way to live, I think.
Hmm. And when it's interesting to hear how even the participants would have their own expectations, right? And the energy is also different once, you get to meet them. Um, it might be a silly question, but did everyone that you meet end up in the book? Almost everybody.
Yeah, no. So everyone except for a couple people who decided otherwise.
Hmm.
Um, I can think there was two people who decided they just didn't want their story out there.
Sure. Hmm.
Um, there's another person who had their own kind of book coming out, and it's like they're sharing their memoir, but they didn't want, I think they were thinking that they were going to come out at the same time. Anyways, um, so those situations, and then there were a couple people who hadn't immigrated themselves, but were willing to meet with me and share and talk, and so those there's a few people who really like were awesome to meet, and
Yeah.
I took their picture, but when deciding on how to edit it down, as opposed to, I wouldn't want anyone who met me to share their immigration story. There were a couple people who were either like representative of an organization or
Hmm.
um, someone who's an ally to the immigration kind of community
Yeah.
or movement. But no, so that's very important. Like, and it was the same with Cosmopolis Toronto.
Hmm.
That I mean, one of the things that happens naturally is people will tell you like, oh, you don't have to include my story if you don't want to, or I know it's not interesting, or and
Right.
it wasn't a competition. Like people, I mean, that was a big point is that with immigration stories, so often what is told is either like atrocious, horrible atrocities,
Right.
evil villains,
Yes.
or heroic, magical deeds of kindness. And
Right.
so the truth is, because, immigrants are humans, is that we've got a full range of, uh,
Exactly.
and that's what I'm trying. I didn't want to only go across the country
Mhm.
telling the stories of people who have achieved great success and the American dream is real.
Right.
Um, I wanted the myriad of experiences, and I think that this does capture that. So,
Mhm.
in the book there are there are some celebrities, there's some famous people who have probably told their story, a
Right.
number of times, but there's also a lot of people who have never shared their story
Mhm.
and also never would have believed that anyone would have wanted to hear their story, um, because I think like also just from a public consumption standpoint and like the way the media is, it's like people want people want or are attracted to those extreme stories, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the stuff that people share. And so, I'm well aware that if I created a book that had, a shiny cover and had a book of millionaires, you know, it's going to sell better and it's going to like get more traction. Those people are influencers and they,
Mhm.
and it steamrolls. And the same goes that if I had a book where everybody is in peril at the border
Right.
and it's like a
Like an urgent.
disaster
Yeah. Hmm.
that which many of the people I met had those stories to share or those memories, but I wasn't capturing them in their worst moment. They were, sharing that memory. But most of my time wasn't, well, as it was beforehand. Like, so people who I was meeting knew that I was going to be um capturing, documenting their story well in advance so that they could just decide, do I want to share this? Whereas if I was at the border with my camera, um,
Completely.
photo asking for someone's portrait in their most, harrowing moment, then yeah, they might say, okay, yeah, sure, take my picture, but there's no, longer conversation or like
Mm,
thought process beforehand of like, is this a moment that I want
for
to
sure.
be yeah to be photographed in.
That's true.
um
So,
so the cover as an example, I mean, Rosie crossed that border that she's standing by, but the and being there, returning to the border
mhm,
is a very emotional process. But as you can see, she's now a professor, and she like we drove there, and it's very different than when she crossed as a child. But
I would
she's
assume
had
so.
she's had time to mentally go through what that means to her and how
Mhm.
her identity is connected to that border and stuff.
For
So
sure.
I do think there's a place for news photographers to photograph things that are going on,
Mhm.
and difficult situations. But I also think that there's a need for those in between, um, full spectrum kind of stories that
Mhm.
kind of
Yeah.
say what happens after, right? What happens after the big event?
Mhm. And also, it's sort of, as you mentioned in the intro to the book, it's also like the fabric of, not the fabric, but the connection that the US has to these stories too, right? Because now they are part of the US as a country, they're active members of society, but they have all this history that comes with them and these experiences. And I guess also what you're saying and what I appreciate in sort of these type of projects is that people become participants, like really involved in what they've decided that they want to take part in this project with you, and it's sort of like a partnership at that point. At least that's how I understand it, that they would be willing to open themselves up to you in terms of sharing stories and, breaking bread, all those things.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm still in the process of learning the full meaning of this, but like my own photography practice, um, and I still feel good about 10 years ago in Cosmopolis, Toronto, and the way it was done. Um, but that was kind of the beginning of me moving into this idea of like working with someone,
Mm-hmm.
um, sharing their story together, like a collaboration. And it's not easy. It makes the job a lot harder
Mm-hmm.
because, well, for one, you're emotionally invested. So, now, most people that are in the book, like, I'm friends with on social media.
I was gonna say you
Like
have me.
there's not a distance, right? Like
Yeah.
it becomes personal. They can ask me questions on the fly, like someone's having a rough month, like I don't know, they message me and say like, hey, what's like, can I tell you about,
Sure.
and so it's I would say to a staunch photojournalist from the past, it's like unprofessional, right? Because it's taking out your objectivity,
Mm-hmm.
um, in a sense, right? But that concept of objectivity was so flawed because the photos that photojournalist was choosing to include, were so influenced by whoever they were working for or whoever
Yeah.
they were.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that from exposés on old photographs and truths and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But um, but I also think that a lot of the language that like we use in photography, we capture, we shoot, we take.
Right.
Um, there's a lot of, and then like subjects, right? It's like you're the subject of the photo.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all of this has got there's problems there, and I try my best to be aware of like the complicated nature of a white guy telling like
Mm-hmm.
people of color stories. And all that being said, um, and this is a conversation I've had with my wife a lot because,
Okay.
she's not white, um, and not a man. But it doesn't make me want to stop. And I think that's important that
Mm-hmm.
I I would hate to, remove myself from this process because it's like it's important to like my own learning.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't want to only tell or collaborate with like white men in telling stories.
Right.
Um, and these are issues that I feel are important. And
Yeah.
then in this particular case, like so, with Toronto, it was my grandma who had, immigrated,
Right.
and with the U.S., my dad had emigrated from
Mm-hmm.
Ohio, and I had always every year gone to see my family, and they, and this is something that I do talk about in the end note of the book, but they're from like a very small white place,
Mm-hmm.
and I and I'm it's just very cool that in the end, a lot of family members were very supportive of the book and are interested in it. And
Mm-hmm.
in fact, my aunt was one of like when I did the pre-order was one of the like key sponsors,
Nice.
which is pretty amazing because like it is a very very conservative small white town in Ohio.
For sure.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I kind of in a way hope that this book ends up like on those shelves, like in those places, in those
Mhm.
libraries, um, as opposed to, you know, of course, I'm excited for participants to have a copy and for it
Right,
to be with immigrant organizations, but I think it's the random, you know, white American who doesn't feel connected to immigration
right.
that could really benefit from somehow
Hmm.
engaging with these type of stories, which are in that middle ground, which
Right.
aren't what they're hearing in Fox News or wherever.
Daily
Um,
type of casts. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm glad
So
you I'm glad you said that because I think that's it's sort of like, if you're giving the book to me or somebody who participated in the project, it's kind of like preaching to the converted because we've lived those stories. But I think that's also important because then we see ourselves reflected in these stories. And I think so there's a room for both, in the sense of
right.
people who learn, people who maybe white and don't have the connection, they can learn, I think you might have mentioned in one of your notes is like they can engage with family members about their own stories of immigration. There are people who are still learning through their grandparents or, maybe great grandparents for some people. So I think there's a lot of breadth and groups that it's applicable to. For people who are wondering how to access the book, what's the best way to find it, purchase it, gift it?
I mean, after October 17th, which I'm guessing that
Mhm.
um, it is, you know, I mean, truly, right now you can order it from any bookstore,
Mhm.
any, you know, and of course, I would always encourage people to go to their local bookstore and order it.
Yes.
But if you're a person seeking convenience, you know, all of those big Indigo, Barnes and Noble,
Mhm.
Amazon, you know, it's available. Um, yeah, I mean that's the way to get it. And then in the US, it comes out a little over a week later than that. And we'll see, but I think it's like I mean, there could have been many different iterations because it's
Sure.
like
I'm
the
sure.
the amount of content collected, you know, over a year on the road and you know
Hmm.
tens of thousands of hours of audio interviews and you know I
Well,
don't know how many photographs, but it just trying to narrow it down was was something. In fact, after we done the initial edit, you know, and this is very far along in the process,
mhm.
and when it went to the designer,
Mhm.
Naomi, um, they kind of came back and were like, hey guys, just want to let you know, um, it looks like the book is about 700 pages. So, so it was literally double, which is, I mean, it's already a big photo book, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
it's a heavy book.
Out.
And yeah, so it was, like, and that was already far along. So a lot of things had to happen to make it, you know, more concise. Um, but in the end, I think it does its job. You know, it's probably not the type of book that people read front to back. That's not really how it was meant.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I think it's if you're looking for connection, you know, you're gonna find something, right? Like
Yeah, no, I think so. And I like the notion of having the book and, you may go through one section one time, or you may start at the end and go through it backwards. There's different ways to consume it and learn it and connect with the people that you highlight. So it's one of those books that you can have on your shelves or your coffee tables. People still have coffee tables. For points of discussion, right? Like people might be
yeah,
curious, like what's that, and I think you can gravitate to it at any time, and even in the future as well. So I'm mindful of time here, Colin. Thank you so much for sharing about your journey. I'll be sure to put the link to yourself on your website, on my write-up, and also, where people can find the book. I agree that we can support our local bookstores. So that's usually our first choice. And looking forward to seeing what's next. I know
Thanks.
family's priority right now, so
Yeah.
good wishes on your next arrival.
Thanks. I think we'll need it. It's I need to clean out the nursery. It's just boxes right now. So yeah, there's a lot to do aside from this, I've got two babies, right? Like
Yes,
book baby, human baby, and obviously human
absolutely.
baby is priority. But yeah, I'm excited to like. It's just, I mean, it's a very like Cosmopolis Toronto. Once the book was out, I mean, there was already so much before the book.
Right.
Um, Whereas this, like, it's a very, it's been a long time coming,
Yes.
and yeah, I'm just like very curious how it's received, and um, I mean, the main thing was that I didn't want to create like an art book that could only be in the hands of 100 people
Hmm.
and cost an arm and a leg.
Right.
So it's my hope is that it can be with people that aren't normally consumers of the fine art book crowd type people. And
I think
yeah,
it's acceptable, and I wish it much success as well.
thanks, appreciate it. Keep